What's going on, everyone? I'm just a simple American man here today to react to what does the House of Lords actually do? Now, I have learned a bit more about UK Parliament and the three parts of it, and I've really learned a lot about the House of Commons, but I know a whole other part of it is the House of Lords. And judging by the title of it, it almost sounds like royalty or something when I hear the word Lord. So I don't know if that's a misconception I have, but hopefully this video here can kind of clear up some of the stuff on that and tell me, I guess, what the House of Lords even does, what their role is. I did watch a little video on this explaining it in one of my older videos, but hopefully this will give me a bit more detail. And, with that being said, let's check it out.
Hello and welcome to another TLDR Explains video. In this one we're going to explain the House of Lords, because it's been in the news a fair bit recently. In this one we're going to explain the House of Lords. Hello and welcome to another TLDR Explains video. In this one we're going to explain the House of Lords, because it's been in the news a fair bit recently. As we discussed...
Oh, it's been in the news. A lot of these videos seem to be very, the date is important. This is January 2020? Was something happening in January 2020 with the House of Lords? Hopefully this explains it a little.
Discussed in our video earlier this week, the Lords attempted to amend Johnson's Brexit bill, which somewhat upset the Tories.
Okay, Brexit is a whole thing that I need to learn about, because this is not the first time this has been brought up, and maybe I am sounding extremely, I don't know, what's the word? Out of touch by not having a better grasp of what Brexit was all about. But, I'm open to learning about it. I'm going to learn about it. You know what? That 100% I'm going to learn about Brexit, but let's keep going.
Tories. But it's not the only reason that the Lords have been in the news recently. A couple of days ago, Conservative Minister James Cleverly confirmed that the government has been thinking about moving the House of Lords to York when Parliament starts renovations in 2015. And last week...
Is this a big deal? Hold on, where is the House of Lords? Oh, it's in London. Okay. I assume all of Parliament is in London then? And some of this stuff must seem so obvious to UK people, but trust me, to someone who has lived in America their whole life, only concerned to themselves with American politics their whole life, I have a very narrow view of where things are, how things work. You know what? I think as long as we all acknowledge certain things like that about ourselves and are open to learning, it's all good. House of Lords may move out of London to York. Ah, you know what? Where is York? York, England. Hold on, we're doing a dive here. York, directions to London. How far are we talking here? 2 hours away? You know what? I didn't realize you could drive across the United Kingdom in 6 hours? 7 hours? That's amazing. That is so different. Just the thought of that compared to America. Gosh, it takes 8 hours for me to just get a couple states away. Let alone, if you could just drive across the whole nation and get to all the cool places and do stuff, that I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but that's like kind of awesome. Being in a somewhat smaller nation, actually probably getting to see more of your country. Anyway, I just saw that like 2 hours to, if I'm looking at this journey here, if this is 2 hours, I mean, it's almost 1/3 of the entire island. Like, come on. That's ridiculous. That's so convenient. Anyway, so it'd be moving the House of Lords 2 hours north to York. Is that very significant? Would that be very meaningful? Obviously, if you're moving some kind of national parliament assembly hours from where it's been for a long time, that is going to cause like a big stir.
of Lords to York when Parliament starts renovations in 2015.
Because of
And
renovations.
last week, Rebecca Long Bailey, one of the front
Well, this happened 2 years ago, I have to remember. I'm acting like this is like current events. I need to remember that. So, did this happen? I don't know. I'm going to have to try to find out.
runners in the Labour leadership election, said that she'd replace the Lords with an elected Senate. This idea, or variations of it, had been floated in the past.
Oh, now we're getting to like the politics of it. So, is the House of Lords? Gosh, I feel like I probably learned this in the other video, but I need a refresher because I've been focusing a bit on the House of Commons, which I know is elected representatives, like over 600 of them. Is the House of Lords elected? By the sound of this, sounds like they're not. Let's see.
With an elected Senate. This idea, or variations of it, had been floated in the past. Nigel Farage was always a fan of it when he was running UKIP, and Nick Clegg attempted something similar while he was in coalition. So, in this video, we're going to try and explain why the House of Lords has always been controversial with leading figures from all the main parties, as well as what the Lords actually does and who the Lords are.
Is the House of Lords controversial? Those of you who actually live in the UK and are affected by this? And if it's controversial, I wonder why, and I wonder if everyone agrees on that.
Before we do, though, this topic was recently voted for by our patrons, who said they wanted a whole series of videos about the House of Lords. If you want to say in the videos we make in the future, then you can sign up to be one of our patrons now. There's a link to that in the description.
I hear you.
So, let's get going. What is the House?
I admire the hustle of him talking about his Patreon. He did make a nice video here.
Of Lords. Well, technically, it's the upper chamber of government, and its full official title is the Right Honourable, the Lords Spiritual and Temporal of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in Parliament assembled.
Okay, I mean, everything's got to have an official name, but I can see why we shortened it. It's like 20 words. The Right Honourable. I've heard that phrase. I don't know what I'm thinking of, almost like knighthood or something, the Right Honourable blank. It's how people tend to be introduced. Not really here in America, but I have heard that phrasing before. Is that common in the UK to use this this Right Honourable title? The Lords of Spiritual, Temporal, United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, Parliament. Okay. It's a lot.
For obvious reasons, no one ever calls it that. There are currently 794 Lords, though, unlike the Commons, there's no fixed number, so this is subject to change.
794. My goodness. We have the US does have a House of Representatives which has hundreds of members and a Senate. But 794 is a lot. That's almost 1,000 people. So, and in other things I've seen, the House of Commons they have trouble fitting everyone in that room to begin with. So there's just a lot of, I guess what I'm really wondering is, I want to know if these are all elected representatives, because there's more of these House of Lords members than House of Commons.
Of these 794, 244 are Conservatives, 180 are Labour, 92 are Lib Dem, and 242 are non-affiliated, independent, or crossbenchers. There are also 26 bishops in there.
What was that largest party?
100. Of these 794, 244 are Conservatives, 180 are Labour, 92 are Lib Dem, and 200.
Labor. We don't really have a labor party here. I would have to read some kind of definition to get a better idea of what that party kind of represents.
42 are non-affiliated, independent, or crossbenchers. There are
there's not a lot of independent parties in America. That's one of the biggest drawbacks, I'd probably say, is the lack of diversity of political parties. There's really only two. And I think the more probably better, the more debate, the more variation of ideas where we can hopefully come to a sort of agreement, at least a democratic process on what people want to go with. But I think the more parties, the more ideas put forward is almost always going to be better. So I like the diversity of the parties here.
Also 26 bishops in the House.
Bishops like Catholic bishops, like from the church, I would assume.
known as Lords Spiritual, and 10
Okay.
representatives of other smaller parties. Of the 794, 92 are hereditary peers, making the UK the only country in the world, apart from Lesotho, to have hereditary peers. That might
What hereditary peers? Hereditary peers. I don't know what that is. Hereditary. I know I'm misspelling this, but thankfully we live in the day and age where autocorrect can just bail me out. Are those whose right to sit in the House of Lords is due to their title being inherited from their father? Is that part of the controversy here? Because now we're talking about inheriting power rather than gaining it through electoral processes. Is that the controversy with the House of Lords, that we have this?
country in the world, apart from Lesotho, to have hereditary peers. That
Okay.
might sound bad, but until the House of Lords Reform Act in 1999, there were some 600 hereditary peers. So I guess
Oh.
at least it's progress.
Yeah,
On
sure.
that note, according to
Okay.
the House of Lords Reform Act of 2014, Lords are removed if they don't turn up for a whole parliamentary session, or
I mean, if you don't turn up for an entire, I don't know how a parliamentary session, how long that is, but if you just don't show up, I feel like that's probably a good reason why you should have your membership revoked.
if they commit a crime.
Or if you commit a crime. Makes sense.
Technically, according to the House of Lords Expulsion and Suspension Act of 2015, Lords can also be removed by vote if the other Lords decide on it. But
Oh.
this has never happened yet. The Lords are technically appointed by the Queen, although usually on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. There are two
Huh. So the lords are not really elected, if I understand correctly. They are appointed by the Queen under the recommendation of the Prime Minister. Maybe I don't know what the Prime Minister takes into account when making his recommendations. I don't know what kind of biases would go into that if he would recommend members of his party. We saw earlier when they kind of laid out the demographics of the 2020 House of Lords. It was almost a quarter split. But this kind of answers a lot of questions that I had about this. If I'm understanding correctly, they're not electorally chosen. They're chosen by the Prime Minister, who is chosen through a democratic process. So there's something. And then he recommend. I mean, lots of things in the U.S. work like this. The more I think about it, we elect certain positions, many positions, but then many positions from there are simply chosen in the government by the recommendation of the president or his cabinet members, the people he associates with. So this is common in U.S. government as well. We just don't have a queen. So I don't know what the equivalent to that would be. And I don't know if the queen always accepts the recommendation of the prime minister or declines it sometimes. That would be very interesting to know.
There are two main times that the Prime Minister gets to recommend laws. At the end of Parliament, in what's known as the Dissolution Honours, or when the Prime Minister resigns, for the Prime Minister's
Oh.
Resignation Honours.
So he's not doing this. He's not doing this every day, like all the time. Just let's add Frank and Joey, my buddy, my neighbor. This is not so common that there are very specific times when the Prime Minister can even recommend people for the House of Lords.
Since the House of Lords Reform Act of 1999, any recommendations have to be approved by an independent body, called the House of Lords Appointments Commission. The commission also makes occasional independent recommendations to the Queen.
Well, that's good, probably. It's not just the Prime Minister giving his recommendation. There's a whole thing here. What did he refer to them as?
Appointments.
There's a whole commission. There's a whole committee that looks at his recommendations and together are like, okay, this makes sense, or this is this is something we can go with. Okay.
Commission. The Commission also makes occasional independent recommendations to the Queen for non-political appointments. Because
Okay.
Parliament was dissolved recently, we're actually due a dissolution honours list quite soon. And controversially, we know that Johnson has not recommended John Bercow for a peerage, breaking the convention that the Speaker of the House of Commons gets a peerage upon retiring.
Huh. That's interesting. I've learned more and more about John, the Speaker, just kind of by happen chance when you start learning about the House of Commons. Turns out that a lot of the YouTube videos you come across has this particular speaker who I've talked about. He's a very interesting guy. I didn't know about this little controversy though. Happened about 2 years ago. This video is from 2020, where Boris Johnson, who I also know is not prime minister anymore as of now, 2022. He didn't put forth a recommendation for John, and it's not even. The whole premise is all the speakers usually, the convention is upon retirement, they get that recommendation. So that's kind of a slight, right? That's a diss. That's Boris Johnson going out of his way to really controversially make a statement and say, no, I'm not recommending this guy, even though we literally always do it out of courtesy or tradition or whatever. I'm not doing it. So that's interesting. I can see why that was a controversy.
So that's who's in the Lords, but what do they actually do?
Yeah,
Well,
okay.
as is the upper chamber in Parliament, its main function is to scrutinise, amend and approve legislation. Once a
Okay, so they have an important job. They have an important job. I was wondering. I said earlier, House of Lords almost to an American sounds like royalty. Almost sounds like the crown or something. When you hear the word lords to an American, that is someone kind of under a king or queen, like in that same kind of royalty realm. So it's interesting to learn that they actually have an important process in actually determining legislation, if I can talk correctly, which makes it even more important who is a part of this House of Lords and who is chosen, who is recommended to be on it, because they get a lot of power.
legislation. Once a bill is finished in the Commons, it goes to the Lords, where they can take a look over it. Often, because the Lords have more time on their hands than MPs, and because no party has a majority in the House, the Lords are able to scrutinise legislation a bit more impartially and effectively. Also,
Okay.
Lords are often awarded their peerages thanks to proficiency and expertise in a particular field. So, if a bill is on a specific topic, say the
Oh.
European Union, chances are that there'll be a few Lords available who are experts on that particular topic.
Cool. Okay. That's great. So, yeah, that clears things up a lot. I'm glad they added this. So, the peers, as they call them, in the House of Lords, these people are people not just of status necessarily, but they have expertise. They have knowledge in a variety of places. So when they are scrutinizing certain acts or certain bills that have come from the House of Commons, they have expertise to draw on. It's not just a bunch of random people. Not that I thought it was, but this really clears up that they lean on certain members probably with the appropriate expertise to look at certain laws and bills and scrutinize them accordingly. So yeah, that's great. It's wonderful. Makes a lot of sense.
So, what happens if the Lords disagree with a bill that comes through the Commons?
Yeah.
Well, in the 19th century, the Lords could just flat out refuse to assent the bill. And that means
Really?
it would never receive royal assent and never
That's a lot of power. That would be a huge amount of power. To veto is what we would call it. The president can sometimes have that power to simply veto a bill. The last guy who can it can pass through the House, through the Senate, and then the president can simply say no. Similar to this, where at least in the 19th century, the House of Lords had that power over the House of Commons.
pass into law. However, the Parliament Act of 1911 changed that, so that
Okay.
even if the Lords opposed a bill, they could only delay it for a maximum of 2 years, and couldn't
Huh.
delay money bills relating to taxation or public expenditure.
Huh.
Then, going further, the Parliament Act of 1949 shortened the Lords' maximum delay to 1 year, with some key exceptions.
1 year. This is a strategy in American politics that is used a lot, especially the filibuster. It's basically strategies to delay bills, keep calling votes, keep calling, just using time to prevent bills and laws from being passed, and then hopefully they're forgotten about, or a party trying to push it simply gives up. I don't know if that's kind of similar to what I'm reading here. This actually sounds like they can delay it a year, but then it will go through eventually. It won't just be dropped.
This meant that legally, the Lords can't block most bills, even if they disagree with them. However,
Okay.
the Lords can exercise their political power to try and force the Commons to back down, because if they do delay a
Oh.
bill for a year, it's bound to attract media coverage. This happened.
This is more what I'm talking about. This is like it can be used as a strategy. They cannot directly stop bills or laws, but they can freeze it, stop it for a year, and use that as a strategy to attract attention to maybe get the House of Commons to change their stance on it or succumb to enough pressure to change their stance.
Happened in 2015, when then Chancellor George Osborne tried to push through tax credit cuts, but the Lords decided to block it. And thanks to the ensuing media storm, Osborne quickly backed down on the policy.
Yep.
There's an obvious democratic tension here, though. It's
Yeah.
an unelected chamber frustrating the will of the elected chamber.
That's a wonderful point. That is a great point. Kind of what I was alluding to. The House of Lords is at the end of the day an unelected chamber of members, and the House of Commons is all elected MPs. So you're having this group of unelected people, although they are carefully recommended to be a part of this chamber, they're not directly elected by the people. So giving them power over representatives of the people, I can see where that can be controversial, where people would be like, hey, this doesn't make sense. Aren't we living in a democracy here where the will of the people gets expressed in our laws? We can't just be having these House of Lords who aren't elected by us getting the final say. Am I on track there? Is that about right? That's what I would think this is alluding to.
In order to mitigate this, the Lords are bound by the Salisbury Convention, which dictates that they can't block any legislation that previously appeared in the governing party's manifesto. As well as scrutinising legislation, the Lords have select committees, which produce reports and advice on specific areas. There are 6 permanent select committees in the Lords, and these are...
So, they get to submit advice? That's interesting. How seriously do these recommendations and this advice have to be followed? I wonder. It's all politics, man. It's all the same everywhere. We can have great nations, great governments, such as in the UK and the US, in how they are performed, like philosophically, the democracies. But you always have, when you get down into the details, you have little things like this where you just wonder, like, okay, you have the House of Lords giving these recommendations and these suggestions. Do they have to be listened to? Is there political pressure to listen to certain things? It's all very interesting, but it's kind of the nature of the beast, isn't it?
the European Union Committee, the Science and Technology Committee, the Communications Committee, the Constitution Committee, the Economic Affairs Committee, and the International Relations Committee. In addition to this, there are also temporary...
It sounds like these are very specific committees giving very specific recommendations into things that hopefully they're experts in. So all the recommendations and stuff are probably more in line with what makes sense. I hope. I would think that. I don't know for sure. That's just what I hope.
so-called ad hoc committees, which are formed in response to contemporary issues. Until 2005, there was also a 7th permanent committee, called the Appellate Court, which was essentially the highest court in the UK, composed of so-called law lords.
This would be equivalent to the Supreme Court in the United States, which is the top of the line, furthest court you can push things to make decisions on certain matters. They can have the final say in a lot of things.
Called law lords. Again, this led to a bit of democratic tension, because the old system meant that the most powerful element of the judiciary was contained within the legislature. So, in 2005, to disentangle the judiciary and the legislature, the Constitutional Reform Act replaced the Appellate Committee with the Supreme Court and created an independent commission for judicial appointments called the...
Okay, there we go. So, more similar to the US than I thought, at least in this very specific circumstance, forming a Supreme Court. Although the way they recommend judges may be different, I don't know.
And created an independent commission for judicial appointments, called the Judicial Appointments Commission. Technically, lords can also hold government positions, but this practice has become less common, because, well, it's not particularly democratic to have an unelected politician running a government department. So, that's the lords.
Yeah. Yeah. I really would like to know the sentiment of just the average UK person, what they think about the House of Lords. Because I can see now that they aren't elected, yet they do hold power. They have influence. Very interesting. Very interesting. I can't think of a US equivalent to this, although there may be. Basically, any position that is filled by government, government politician representatives, when they fill positions that are just not straight up elected by the people, I guess would be equivalent to this. And that does happen in the United States.
At first glance, it makes no sense. Having an unelected chamber with hereditary politicians in the UK in the 21st century. But before you dismiss it out of hand, it does have some advantages over the House of Commons. The Commons has an unfortunate selection bias. As everyone knows, most normal people don't want to be MPs. Having a chamber full of...
I've always thought that. I've always agreed with that. Maybe not quite what he's getting at here, but unfortunately, you gotta think, most of the geniuses, the smartest people out there, they want to go start a business or go invent something, become a scientist or a doctor. They don't want to become politicians. So I think it's rare that you probably end up with straight up geniuses, smartest people that society has to offer. They don't end up in politics per se, maybe 1 out of 1,000, whatever. But that's very interesting. Like, kind of what he's getting at here is that you won't always get the absolute best person for the job. Whoever that is, some no-name out there that you'll never hear about because he decided to become the best dentist in the world. They won't become part of these chambers because they don't want to be politicians. Because a lot of people don't want to go through all that.
People who never set out to be politicians. Normal people don't want to be MPs. Having a chamber full of people who never set out to be politicians, but are merely there due to the virtue of their talent and expertise, who aren't constantly afraid of the electorate, seems to have served the UK well thus far.
I like that. That's a great point. I like that. I can't think of anything like that in the US. I mean, every organization, including our government, has committees, has boards created of people who are not politicians and are just experts. So, in a sense, we have them, but they're small, they're for very specific things, specific committees. Nothing like an entire house, nothing like an entire branch of government created out of these kinds of people that actually look at the laws being created and passed by something like a House of Commons. That's a fascinating concept.
Even if it isn't particularly democratic. Anyway, if you'd like us to do another video on the future of the House of Lords...
Wow, that was fascinating. Really cleared up a lot of the questions I had about the House of Lords. I was wondering if they were elected or not, and it sounds like they are not elected, but you would be quick to jump on that and scrutinize it and say, oh, no, we don't want things like that. But then we had some great points about, well, these people are chosen for because of specific attributes at least, and to provide a different outlook on things, more of a normal person outlook. Although I wonder if in practice that is what happens, or if there are biases involved in the selection, in the recommendations of who gets to join the House of Lords. They're probably not just adding the random common man who truly represents like the average person. They're probably adding certain people. You can't help but have those biases in any government on earth, in any chamber that's not elected by vote, by the people. But there are some positives to this that are really interesting. Very interesting. I never had any concept of a branch of government that could work like this. And you can come up with very interesting positive reasons to have it, whereas before I don't think I would have been able to quite see it that way. So I'm really glad I watched this video. This is fascinating, and came up with some really interesting points, different points of view, which you gotta love. That's why I love different points of view, man. Great. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, if you enjoyed this reaction, feel free to leave a like, leave a comment, and if you enjoyed me reacting to more UK videos about UK things, go ahead and subscribe for more videos like this. So until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.